I just realized my microphone was off. Thank you all for being here and for joining us in this webinar. We are going to give it a few more minutes to allow additional folks to join in. So in approximately 3 to 5 minutes or so, we'll go ahead and get started. If you have any questions along the way, instead of using the raise hand function, please go ahead and ask your questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We look forward to getting started just shortly. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Panelists, if you could please turn your cameras on. And I would like to welcome everyone for being here on behalf of the Executive Negotiation Project. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're so happy to have you here in this very important conversation, this webinar that will be focused on meaningful community and stakeholder engagement. During your registration for this webinar, you likely saw that this is actually the first of 4 webinars that are focused on a variety of elements around humanitarian technology, and specifically thinking more about the digital divide in humanitarian innovation, humanitarian ICT technologies. And so while today's webinar is focused on stakeholder and community engagement, the following few will be focused on subjects including partnership and thinking about supporting community-led innovation, as well as the inclusion and engagement of women. And each of these webinars, as you can see here today, has an incredible set of panelists who I'll just introduce you to momentarily. And so over the next hour, we're going to hear from the folks here, again, who I'll introduce to you in just a moment, in hearing about the ways in which meaningful stakeholder and community engagement can be achieved in thinking about technologies. And so technologies have played a role in the humanitarian space for some time now, but there are still questions about how do we do this? How do we do this well in engaging people who have been affected by crisis and also local organizations. And so I will be your moderator for today. If you haven't already determined that, my name is Zaira Khan. I am a project coordinator for a few different programs at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, but my focus is primarily on geospatial technologies. And in thinking about maps and imagery and remote sensing, spatial statistics, I'm also constantly thinking about what does engagement look like, particularly when we're creating data-driven products, that may be impacting decision making. So again, I'm thrilled to be here and to hear more and learn more from the panelists we will be hearing from today. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce today's panelists. And then first, we're starting with, on my screen and in order, Laura Frost, who has been a consultant with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative for the last few months and is the main author of the case study on this subject. So something that I missed to mention before is that this webinar is the series is a culmination of a series of case studies that was conducted, a project funded by USAID in thinking about a variety of these elements, which each of these webinars will cover. And so with that said, towards the end of the hour, I will be sharing a link with you all as well that has a draft of this, this case study focused on community and stakeholder engagement. I encourage you to read it and provide feedback also via the link. So Laura will delve a little bit more into that, give you a preview of what's in that. And again, I encourage you to look at it. But Laura is a partner and co-owner of Global Health Insights, and she is a researcher and a writer for over 20 years and is focused and works with a lot of global health and humanitarian organizations in thinking about access to technology, maternal and child health, as well as universal health coverage. Next, we have Cleopa Otieno. Cleopa is currently the CEO of Kenya Flying Labs and works in country with organizational partners as well as individuals in exploring the use of UAVs, so unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, some people call them as well, for their own work. But Cleopa has experience in over 10 years in all things ICTs in the social goods sector. So really looking forward to hearing more about his experiences also. But then last and certainly not least, we have Safia Verji, who is currently working with CARE Denmark as a regional innovation advisor for East Africa. She has over 10 years of experience within the NGO sector, working on resilience programming and humanitarian innovation. All three of our panelists happen to be in Nairobi in Kenya, but they offer a breadth of experiences and we'll be speaking to some of that in today's session. As we go through and as I hand it over to the panelists who you're here to hear from, I encourage you as the audience members to please use your Q&A box, as I just mentioned earlier, to ask questions. Already I see some questions coming in, so thank you for your participation. I'll be scanning through and reading them. So with that said, I'll hand it over to our panelists, and perhaps in the order in which I introduced you, please introduce yourself further. In my 2 sentences on introducing you, cannot sum up the wealth of information experience that you have. So please elaborate on your current role and introduce yourselves in terms of your experience in thinking about meaningful stakeholder engagement, which I know is something that all of you have thought about quite a bit in your work. So please, as you're introducing yourself, also please add what effective, meaningful, good stakeholder and community engagement looks like to you. And perhaps some of the challenges that exist and why we aren't quite there yet. These are really big questions, so feel free to touch on them. And as we go through, we'll continue to have a conversation. So with that said, I will stop talking and first hand it over to Laura.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for putting together this panel on this really important topic. So my remarks today will really be in the context of the research that we've done, which looks specifically at how digital technology in humanitarian settings can be developed and implemented with meaningful community and stakeholder engagement, which I always felt was this huge mouthful. So I think we should break that down a little bit. I think, we felt this was really an important topic to research because digital transformation in the humanitarian sector has been largely top down. There has been limited meaningful engagement with affected communities, with local organizations, and with other stakeholders, including frontline humanitarian staff. And that's despite strong rationales for engagement. And so we set out to speak to people in organizations all over the world. And we wanted to talk to people who had undertaken engagement processes and really understand the challenges that they faced and how they addressed them and pull out some lessons learned. The first thing that we had to do was say, well, what do we mean by meaningful engagement? And so this really gets to your first question, Sarah. And I think for me, the word engagement is used interchangeably with so many other words. So, we talk about participation, we talk about empowerment, we talk about sensitization. So what do we really mean? And I, like others, like to think about it on a continuum between one-way communication and two-way, multi-way communication. And then the engagement can take different forms. So, you start on this end with informing. And then you can talk about consulting or obtaining feedback. Then you move towards involving people. And then you talk about collaborating. And then you end with empowerment all the way over at the two-way communication end. And for me personally, that's what I'm interested in is these forms of engagement, which are at that end. Engagement can really occur at any point in a technology's life cycle. So we can talk about it in terms of problem recognition, design, development, implementation, adaptation. And these are things that I think that we will talk more about today. But this question meaningful, this word meaningful, what do we mean by that? And I think the way I think about it is that when an engagement process, when there's feedback, is that feedback then seriously considered in decision-making about a digital technology? So that's how we thought about meaningful engagement. And then to get to your second question, what are some of the barriers? What are some of the reasons that meaningful engagement falls short? We could talk about this for a while, but just some top level comments on that. First of all, oftentimes engagement processes don't happen at all. So is that because there's no funding, no time, no expertise in an organization? People talked about the fact that there's not a shared understanding across an organization about what is meant by engagement, how that pertains to digital technology, why it's important. Other people talked about how, the principles and methodologies for community engagement aren't embedded in organizational systems. And that also some of the people who are involved in engagement processes are siloed off into maybe research and design parts of an organization and aren't linked with other parts of organizational workflows. But even when engagement happens, oftentimes it's not meaningful in the sense that we just talked about. And why would that be? Well, sometimes the resources that people have for engagement, it's just a once-off. It's just for like a once-off consultation and not a continuous process. And so there's not time for learning and adaptation. So that's one problem. Sometimes engagement starts too late after really important decisions about selection of technology has already been made, about design of technology or how it's going to be implemented. Sometimes the form of engagement is just about, it's at this end, the one-way communication. It's about gathering information. And we refer to this in the case study as extractive. and it's not then fed back into the decision-making process. Sometimes engagement processes, it's just about ticking the box, and there's not a real thought process that goes into inclusion. Who should be involved? Who should be facilitating? And we can come back to these inclusion issues later. And then another issue is that sometimes there's a failure to establish feedback loops. People don't get feedback on their feedback. And when that happens and you share information in an engagement process, and then you don't know what happens with it, many interviewees that we spoke to talked about this leading to a lot of mistrust and disillusionment. And so this is also a critical issue. But I don't want to end the early remarks on a negative note. So to flip it over, I'd like to say in the research, we learned about all sorts of ways that people are addressing these challenges. Whether they're being more intentional about inclusion, fine-tuning approaches, whether it's human-centered design or two-way communication, co-creating understandings about engagement across an organization, building into standard operating procedures, and supporting community-based innovation. But these are issues that our other panelists, Safia and Cleopa, know way better than I do. So I think this is a good time to hand back to them.
Maybe Cleopa, over to you for your initial remarks. And please feel free also to respond to any of Laura's comments.
Thank you so much, and it's quite a pleasure to be here today. So community engagement is a critical subject, even in the work that we do at Kenya Flying Labs, because we work with communities a lot. Our work is using new technology, drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles. And most often, these are not technologies that people are used to. Some have very negative, influence about this, because they feel that drones are about war. Drones have no good side, because that is what they've lived knowing about. That's what the media shares all the time. But indeed, this technology can change lives, can save lives in many ways. But nevertheless, the communities need to know what we are up to with this technology in their communities. So to respond to your first question on meaningful community engagement and stakeholder engagement, personally, I feel that we need to take cognizance of the fact that these communities have a right to be informed, to be consulted, to be empowered with information, and to be involved. And in that structure, we also need to have a feedback loop where we're able to give them the results and share these findings with them. Because if indeed we are working to support them and improve their lives, then they need to be part of the process, even of this data collection itself. If we get that buy-in, I believe that we don't run into any issues. A lot of sustainability issues with community projects that I've seen has been because of poor community engagement. Initially, when the project comes in, it comes in with an intention of supporting the community, but maybe it's a research that then carries this research to a university, into some paper sitting in some shelf somewhere. If this can be put in a way that can be simplified so that communities really get to understand what the outcomes are, and also in doing community engagement, I think there is need to really understand how the community have been handling these issues by themselves, because without your technology, something has been happening, life has been going on. So getting a chance to really understand how the community already understands that problem and deals with it in terms of things like indigenous knowledge, because this knowledge is has been passed through generations, and it's helped them in different ways. The tech only comes in to perhaps simplify it and make it more effective. So getting to really understand how this happens, I think, is critical towards getting meaningful engagement with stakeholders in these communities. And therefore, also how we share this, how we conduct this meaningful engagement needs to be through ways that the communities are comfortable with. If you're going to go with posters, would you consider some of these posters being in a local language, in a local dialect that the community really understands? Because not everybody in that community understands English or Swahili or French or whatever language it is. If you're going to do online campaigns, does the community have access to these devices to see your campaign? And these questions will then allow you to get to know the right way to reach the community. Perhaps face to face would be the best, because they like to talk, they like to interact, they want to meet new people. Perhaps going to religious institutions like churches or mosques or community meetings. In Kenya, local chiefs organize what we call barazas, and these barazas are respected. People come once a week or once a fortnight to get updates from the chief. And if we can take advantage of these structures that already exist, then we are able to reach even more community members. And so why is this important? Because as much as it needs to be meaningful, I think the question of why is also very key. And as development workers, we want to do this in a respectful way, because we respect the communities, we respect the ways of life, we respect their culture. We want to do community engagement to be able to understand them. We want to create awareness so that our product, our service, or our technology is understood, and we have buy-in from the community. We want to be able to create genuine partnerships and allies, because even after you're done, maybe there'll be another opportunity to come back. So if you create these allies, and if you create a network and a good relationship with the community, then that's an entry for you for the next engagements. We also want to minimize risk and identify some of the risks that we may not have seen while conceptualizing these solutions. I think also to just better understand context and needs, as well as increasing our chances of these projects getting sustained, because sustainability is one of the key challenges of most projects that come into communities. And it could be as simple as just not doing impactful and meaningful community engagement. You may find that you have skills within the community that can contribute to the project. And you may find offers in terms of even a place to locate your projects, a building that's not used, that you can be handed over to you because they feel that they need that service, and therefore no need for you to hire and spend money on another venue when they already have something. So I think this really helps us to create a relationship, basically. In order to also do meaningful community engagement, I think we need to be good listeners. We need to, pay attention. We need to take notes, write as much as we can. If possible, get a translator if you're not able to understand the language, because some of the places we work, the communities do not understand the languages that we come in with. Are we able to come in with somebody who can give you translations to really understand what that old lady or old man is saying in the village? And on to why does, meaningful engagement fall short? I think literally, not doing the things that the first speaker and myself have listed, and just coming into the community because you feel that this is a solution that is going to save these people's lives and it's a good solution. Let me drop it in and see how it goes. So I think getting that, avoiding assumption and really getting to understand the community, and also having good intentions, because not everybody who comes in with these projects have good intentions. I think also creating a feedback loop that the results can then be translated and can be given to the community with the intention of helping them improve whatever it is that the project or the engagement intended to improve. And also, I think transparency, just being clear to the community members that, we are collecting these images and it's not for anything else. We're going to create maps that will help you understand your boundaries well. We're going to create maps that will help you understand your terrain. And these are problems that they face and they probably don't have solutions to. And your program may be really what they need, but how we come in, I think, really matters. So I'd like to end it there and give an opportunity to Safi as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleopa and Laura. I'm not really sure what else I can add here, but maybe just to strengthen the points that both of you have made. So, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. Like Syra said in the intros, my name is Safia. I'm currently working with CARE Denmark as the Regional Innovation Advisor. So I work in the East Africa region. And my primary role is to support the country offices with their innovation projects and to think through what innovative approaches and tools can we use to support communities, primarily focusing on the climate crisis. But I have had about 10 years of experience working with communities in resilience programming and also innovation programming. And a lot of that involved interacting and working with the community. And I think from that, what I can add is community engagement, I think, is something that we take for granted just because we're working with the communities. And we think that, we've established trust where, they know us, we know them. And so we don't need to spend a lot of resources or time in terms of designing the project. We know what they need. They've told us. But I think this is where we make our first mistake. I think from the get-go, somehow it just doesn't feel like an equal footing. We don't come to the table with the intention or the perception that everybody has something to offer. More like there's this project, there's this donor, and they want to solve your water problems, and this is what they want. So often the solution is really designed to what the donor is willing to fund. And I think that we don't take time to understand what are the needs of the community, but also what are their desires outside of the donor requirements. And I think that we need to be better in terms of sitting around the table and understanding what are the capacities that exist within the communities, what do they feel that they can do themselves, and where do they need our help? So this is very broadly and idealistically speaking, but these are just some of the things that I've thought about throughout the last few years. Words that come to mind that I think Laura has said and also Cleopa has said is collaborative, participatory, and consistent, I think, are really important. So often community engagement is, the first activity you do at the beginning of a 4-year project, and then it's never repeated again in the activity list or in the budget. So I think that's also something that we really need to think about, is that whole feedback loop and coming back and saying, okay, this is what you had said, this is what we, put into the proposal that we submitted. Are we still okay with this? Has something changed, etc.? So just that continuous feedback loop, I think, is really important. And then, of course, the context relevancy in terms of where community engagement plays such a big role. I think, like Cleopa said, spending time and getting to know the environment. There's different cultural dynamics, there are different religious dynamics, society dynamics that somehow you can only know by spending time and observing in there. So, like, for example, who holds the power within communities, who are the decision makers? Those are sometimes the things that come as you spend time within and try to understand the community. I think in terms of where we fall short in terms of meaningful engagement, so often as humanitarian organizations, we're really working with communities that are currently going through a crisis or a disaster. And so it often feels like an emergency situation, and you feel like you really need to act fast, and you need to go in with the solution, whether it's an app, whether it's drone delivery, whatever it is, right? And we feel like we really need to go in and help. So it's with all good intentions, but I think we just need to take a step back and make sure that we are spending time to really understand what are the needs and desires of the community and the stakeholders that we're working with. Laura mentioned the restrictions on budget as well. And I think that this is also something, as humanitarian organizations working within communities, we really need to advocate for with donors. We need to make sure that there is enough budget and time allocation for community engagement throughout the entire process of the project. I also think that sometimes we go in and, I've been there, and it's like you call the local chiefs or you call the village elders and you say, guys, we have a donor who wants to fund XXX. And it's like, if they feel like, if they, feedback or they have a different opinion, then they're not going to get that project. And I think that is our mistake in how we present the opportunity to the community. And we've done it, and somehow it's always our first response, because again, we only get like 2-3 weeks to submit a proposal in some instances. So I think those are some of the challenges and restrictions that we face that unintentionally make us fall short in terms of meaningful engagement. So I think that would be my additions to what both Laura and Cleopa have said. And yeah, really looking forward to sort of discussing this a little bit more. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much for so much content. And I think each of the remarks that you've made deserve a whole webinar in themselves. So there's no time for us to unpack every single thing that has been shared. But I think I just want to reiterate how from all three of you, we were hearing so much about feedback loops and making sure you're engaged constantly and consistently. And I think that is something that within especially limited funding cycles, as I think Safia, you were just pointing to, but everyone and as well in terms of limited budgets, how do we make sure that is included? And I think particularly as you were just saying, Safia, also in terms of how, as in crises, can we make sure that these processes are done sustainably and done well? So I have so many questions to follow up, but I think something that I'm also particularly interested in hearing, perhaps before digging into some of these questions, is who should be involved in some of these processes. So I think we're talking about community and stakeholders at large, and I think Safia, you'd also just mentioned village elders specifically. But are there specific groups who are perhaps overseen at times, or organizations who are not as frequently engaged? So I'm wondering if there is usually the same target group that is considered, and if there is an approach, again, there's a wider base of community and stakeholder engagement, who should be included, and how do we go about making sure that everyone is included. Again, in thinking about, all the challenges along the way, but if you can maybe speak to groups of people who perhaps excluded so far, and thinking about how to do that further. And I will leave it open to whoever wants to answer first. Maybe I can jump. Oh,
okay.
Go ahead, Cleva, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in terms of who should be included in the process, I think there's the communities have their leadership structures, and understanding who these leadership structures include is important to be able to target the right people who can also help you in mobilizing more community members, because maybe you're not able to reach them if you don't go through these leaders. There are youth groups as well. Women are organized into groups in many societies, and they have their leaders, men as well. I think there needs to be a bit of gender balance as well. We may not have control of this in some instances, but I think it should be intentional to try and get feedback from different gender within the community. So I think community leadership, working with youth groups, women groups, and men groups, if there are, and also considering gender balance. I think that would be my input on who to really target.
Yeah, I think I would add, or I would agree with what Cleva is saying. The gender one is a no-brainer these days. Of course, the cultural aspects come into play a role, but I think as much as possible, there needs to be an equal representation of both men and women. I think when we're talking digital as well, digital solutions, the youth also play a very key target role, because often you'll find that they're the most tech savvy, or the most sort of digital literate within communities. And often the more rural you go, they're the ones that do the mobile banking, etc., for the elders and the families. So I think that the youth also play a key role. I think also a target group that often gets left out are people living with disabilities. Even as we're planning community engagement activities, do we cater for people who, are deaf or blind, or, need access by wheelchair, when we're thinking of even where to host community engagement sessions? So I think for me that those would be my inputs in terms of where I go to in my mind when I'm thinking about community engagement and who needs to be there. But I think across the board, you need to think of every single representation, even in this sort of emerging society. We also need to think of the LGBTQ community as well. Thanks, Sarah. That's all for me. Would you like to add anything, Laura?
Sure. I learned a lot about inclusion in this paper. And so some of the things in this research project, just to add, some of the things to add is that we have a tendency to oversimplify who are the users of a technology. And we fall back on the same people all the time in terms of who to invite to engagement processes. So I think it's really, really helpful to hear from Safia and Cleopa as to how to think about this. And I think something they've also referenced is how do you then think about engaging these particular groups? So, where are you going to engage in person? You need to think about accessibility issues. Are you going to engage via mobile phones? How does that affect reaching women? So I think there are a lot of different issues to think about. An issue that came up again and again and again that Cleopa has mentioned is language, and community engagement processes have to think a lot about language. And many people that I spoke to talked about how, they've been doing engagement efforts for years, but that it's still very English based. And so there's this huge language divide in what they do. And I think that having funds and time for translation and thinking about language intentionally is really important. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that we must also always think about power dynamics between facilitators of engagement processes and participants, and that it takes time to build trust. And again, this is also something that both Cleopa and Sophia have mentioned. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for those very, very important answers. And just to plug for a future webinar, if you're interested in hearing specifically more about the inclusion and engagement of women, that is also something that we'll be talking about more in depth. But coming back to this conversation and thinking a little bit specifically about, I think, Safia, you mentioned it in terms of the youth who are tech savvy. So I want to switch over to that tech component a little bit. And I'm going to combine some audience questions here. And again, I open it up to you to answer however you see fit, and in whichever order. So there's some questions coming in. And again, for audience members, please feel free to continue asking them. These are wonderful questions. So thinking a little bit in a bit of a two-question thing, but thinking about different social media platforms, private messaging, some of the very commonly used day-to-day technologies such as Facebook, WhatsApp, WeChat, you name it. How can those be used? Are those being used for effective community engagement? That would be kind of the first part of that question. And then thinking specifically more in a disaster response, what are some effective digital tools and technologies? Is it perhaps the Facebook and the WhatsApps, or are there other also forms of technology that you have seen in your experience have been particularly useful in such responses? So again, a bit of a two-part, but all technologies, which have worked well successfully for community engagement in just nonprofit projects as well as disaster settings. Again, a loaded question, but leave it all to you to respond. Okay, if I go first. Okay. So maybe for the first question that you had, I don't have too much experience in terms of the instant messaging tools, but from what I know or in past experiences, it has been a great way to communicate with response organizations to ensure that response is happening as fast as possible. So I know WhatsApp and Twitter work really well in terms of communicating directly with response agencies. And it's just about quickly verifying that information by calling them back or asking for more details in terms of location, etc. So I think there is a lot of potential in terms of that. I think we just need to be careful in terms of how to filter through sometimes all that information that's coming through, and how to really verify some of the messages that you get. I think in response to the second question around digital and tech innovations for disaster response, previously at least in Kenya, I know that we're now, like, cash transfers is mostly moved to digital mobile transfer because we have M-Pesa here. And so it makes the process a lot quicker, faster, secure. But again, there are challenges with that in terms of, the digital divide and making sure nobody is left behind, because in order to get an M-Pesa account, you need an official ID. And we have a lot of people living in Kenya that don't actually have an ID for various reasons. One could just be that they didn't have the prerequisite documents like your birth certificate, etc. Those tend to get lost in disaster situations, or the access to an office that can do your ID card sometimes is just too far. So you have a lot of, especially older people living without an ID, and so they don't have an M-Pesa account, which then brings me back to why they are usually managing their M-Pesa. So I think that's something we've tried, and then a second thing we've tried, and Cleopa, you'll forgive me, but I'm going to walk into your territory a bit, but we have used satellite imagery and drones for disaster response. And that's basically just to enhance the effectiveness and the efficiency of responding. But something that we found a challenge in that is, one, there's obviously like Cleopa mentioned, the whole perception around drones and the fear of is it people spying on us or surveillance, etc. But there's also connectivity. So when you're out in the rural areas, it's a community been affected by floods. It's really hard to sort of get a good stable connection to create maps, etc., and send them back to HQ and get response equipment dispatched. And then I think across the board, a challenge in terms of using digital is the whole aspect of data protection that's coming into play. And I know a lot of organizations are working on this and how to make sure that data that's coming in through apps, through drone imagery, satellite imagery, this data is protected for the communities. So yeah, I think that's sort of what I have to share on those remarks. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that very elaborate answer. If anyone else wants to chime in, please feel free. But otherwise, we have many good questions coming in that that we can go into. Perhaps I think a question that's come up a few times in a couple of different ways is, in thinking particularly about these digital technologies and some of the challenges that you also just raised, Safia, what are some of the key recommendations for donors as well as humanitarian organizations to make sure that communities who are using these technologies or ideally should have access to these technologies in such responses, if they're heavily reliant on such, how can they be included in the digital programming effectively? So what are some recommendations that you would have to offer to international organizations, to donors, and also local organizations?
If I may go first on that, and I think the main one for my side is just for them to be able to understand that this is a key aspect of the project itself, and it needs to be well budgeted for and given enough time to be handled. And indeed, the community engagement happens way before the project starts, so it needs to have a realistic timeline. Some communities are also hostile. You may be going into a war zone, you may be going into just communities that do not interact with other people well, and therefore you need more time and more strategies to be able to reach them. I think also, developing policies around this idea and working with governments on the same could be something that these development partners can help influence, because I think lack of a proper framework is part of the reason why it's not done effectively. So I think budget for me is a big one, and just for them to really understand that this is indeed, and it may not happen only once, it may happen during the beginning of the project, midway, just to connect again with the community, and for them to also understand whether these interventions are really helping. And then in the end, so it's more monitoring and evaluation, but has aspects of still community engagement to be able to get back to the community and have that feedback loop that has been mentioned before. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cleopa. Laura, Safia, anything else you'd like to add? Or are we okay? All right. Thank you. We're quickly closing in on the hour. And again, thank you so much for everyone who's asking such wonderful questions. I think perhaps we'll have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up some closing remarks. And I have another question that I would like to build into your closing remarks if possible. But perhaps in the meantime, let's see, there's so many good questions. Actually, maybe Laura, Safia, Cleopa, you also see the questions. Are there particular ones that you think are important just to close up with now? Sorry, I think I just gave everyone the task of being the moderator. I wanted to give you an opportunity also to look at the many questions coming in. I'm also happy to continue asking. So I think there's a lot of questions coming in, particularly on the role of donors, of organizations. And I think something also that's interesting to think about is that when organizations come in, how do we ensure that projects and technologies that are being implemented, whether it's survey technologies or different programs that are running, different UAVs, for instance, how do we make sure that those are all speaking to each other? I think because technology can collect so much data, but how do we make sure that organizations in a variety of capacities come together effectively and with a sense of equity and equality? What would be some recommendations around that? Because again, thinking through, and so, you've mentioned this so many times and it's coming in the comments as well, is that often these are just crises that are happening very quickly. But how can we establish those relationships in a crisis, but also long term? And I leave that to you before we close.
I think I can take a stab at it. I mean, I don't know if there's one specific answer to that question. But I think what happens in terms of a best practice is that you usually have an organization that plays the overall coordination role, and they sort of convene these meetings and these engagement sessions, and that's to ensure that organizations provide services or interventions where their expertise lies. But again, that's unfortunately that comes across as sort of a very top-down approach, in the sense that you have all these organizations and stakeholders around the table deciding that, okay, you're going to do water access, you're going to do food, you're going to do cash, etc. And you have community representation there, but it's for the whole community. So then, as you were mentioning, like individual groups are also not represented by themselves. It's a one person for the whole community. But I like I said, I don't know if there's a better way it's been done in terms of like an emergency or disaster situation. I think it's just the most effective way to making sure people don't suffer more than they have. So I think then the question comes to maybe more resilience programming and how we can ensure that there's no duplication of activities, and people or organizations sort of make sure that they are in touch with each other and that everybody sort of knows what's going on ground. And I think there are efforts in terms of having that. You have technical working groups, you have, at both county or community level, regional level, etc. So in that sense, there's a lot of learnings and knowledge that's being shared in terms of programming. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sarah. I don't have a sort of direct answer, but I think that's just what I would say.
Thank you. Cleopa, Laura, anything else you'd like to add to that? Otherwise, we will turn to closing remarks. And again, hours come up so soon. Okay. So before I hand it back to you, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you and for everyone who is attending to join in us on the conversation. I think this has been a conversation, but now it's about turning this into action. So I do hope that you take all of this and think about it back in your own work. I would like to give each of you, Laura, Safia, and Cleopa, the opportunity to close and reflect a little bit more on this discussion that we had today briefly. But as you would do, to also end it on a positive note in terms of there's still, many things, many challenges that are to be overcome, but maybe also answering the question that was also posed by an audience member is, what places do you see the digital world having overcome humanitarian divides? So I think there are still divides that exist, but in which ways have we seen it be overcome? So as you perhaps comment and reflect overall on the things that have been discussed today, if you would also like to just touch upon that question as you close it off. So I'll hand it over to Laura first, perhaps, and then Cleopa and Safia, and then I'll finish it up.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour of information. And I think just something that I heard repeatedly from people is just that community engagement, meaningful engagement requires a mindset shift and intentional work to put in place processes and to really think about inclusion and ways of reaching people and then building that back into decision making. And so I think when I think about this in a positive sense, there's a lot of work that's happening around all of those steps. And if anybody's interested, some of that is documented in the paper. And we really look forward to people's feedback on that. Over to you, Cleopa.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's been a great hour of sharing and learning. My takeaway would be that the community here is the boss, and we need to be able to understand them, to support what they do by using technology or whatever solution we come in with. And therefore taking as much time as possible to be able to understand where they're coming from, understand their ways of life, understand who they really are, how they've done it in the past, will give us a perspective that maybe we never had and could help us in designing programs that really complement what already works by infusing technology into it. So that would be my parting shot. Thank you very much.
For me, I would say that, I think as humanitarian organizations and as practitioners, we need to capacity build ourselves to work with the communities. We need to learn the languages, we need to learn the cultural references, all the intricacies of the communities that we're working with. And then we go to the table and sit around as equals and discuss on how to help each other. So I think that, it's not a long way away. I think there are a lot of good things that are happening in terms of now, even just bringing in the human-centered design approach, really putting the affected community at the center of problem solving. And I know that there's a lot more investment in terms of time and money that's going into this. So there's definitely a lot more attention and care being given to community engagement, which is really nice to see. In terms of digital solutions, there is so much potential in terms of getting to communities faster, learning about how to respond a little bit faster, and just sort of saving lives. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think we just need to be mindful of some of the limitations that come with digital, and that it doesn't replace that human touch that we've had for so many years. So I think that would just be my parting shot to end on a positive note as well. Thank you.
Thank you all again so much, panelists, attendees. This has been a wonderful hour, and I know there's so many more questions. We're going to have, again, repeated webinars over the next month, with the next one on supporting community engagement, thinking a little bit more of the role of donors also in this conversation. So I encourage you to come back to that. But panelists, thank you so much. I think you all, with your closing remarks, hit the nail on the head. I think, you know, there's good things going on. There's more to be done. And I would say that everything that was discussed today pertains to both general, meaningful stakeholder engagement, but also specifically to technology. And I think that as technology increasingly is incorporated as a tool, as you're saying, Safia, it's not the end. It's really the means to support this together with human interaction. There's an obligation that we use that responsibly and use that effectively, so that while it's increased the reach of humanitarian activities, there is a risk also of greatening that digital divide if we don't meaningfully engage individuals, organizations, to make sure that we effectively respond. So I hope that this was helpful. Please take a look at the chat. There is a link there for the case study that dives into this, that Laura was the primary author on. We welcome your feedback and hope that is something that you can take back and also use. So thank you all again. And I will see you next week. And for everyone else, thank you so much again. Have a wonderful day.